Hello and welcome to Not Made in China, the podcast sharing unfiltered, honest conversations about adoption and the beautiful madness that comes with it. I'm Shaosheen, your host, and today's conversation is about identity and what it's like to grow up Chinese in spaces that are mostly white, and then trying to make sense of that later in life. I'm joined by the lovely Kat, a Chinese adoptee who wrote her PhD on the British Chinese adoptee experience, exploring things like cultural identity and connection, how we choose the labels we use, experiences of racism, and the stories we're so often told about being lucky or privileged to be adopted. But what makes this conversation so interesting is that the research didn't come from a distance. It came from her lived experience, her own questions, and from listening to other adoptees, recognizing parts of herself in their stories. We talk about how connection to Chinese culture can be built later in life, and why belonging isn't something you either have or don't have. It's something you're constantly negotiating. I'm so excited to share this conversation with you, because it really shows how listening to others can help you understand parts of your own story. We have a lot to talk about, so let's jump into it, and I hope you enjoy eavesdropping on our conversation. So Kat, thank you so much for joining me, and welcome to Not Made in China.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege to be here, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Well, first of all, congratulations for submitting your PhD. That's a huge accomplishment. How does it feel?
Well, yeah, thanks. It feels like a long time coming. It has been an immensely long experience, but very fulfilling. And I am really kind of relieved, as well as I do feel proud of the work that I've achieved. And I really hope that I make my participants proud as well when I give them the completed product.
I've no doubt that you will. And I know we're going to chat loads in detail about your research. But can you just give us a quick overview of what the PhD is actually about?
Yeah, of course. So my PhD is based on the lived experiences of British Chinese adoptees and the relationship that they've had with their predominantly white environments that they've grown up in, and how this kind of affects their perceptions of their self and their ethnic and racial identity, and also how it affects their relationships with the idea of privilege, because a lot of people assume that because we're adopted, we've come into these lives of privilege and that we must feel sort of grateful for sort of being here. And that's something that I really wanted to, unpack and examine a lot more.
That's fantastic. And can I ask, why the British Chinese adoptee experience?
Yeah, so this is a good question. And I think that when I started this PhD, I was obviously told to do something that I feel really passionate about. And I did my master's back in 2019, I think. And I did my master's on the British Chinese adoptee experience because I wanted to use an opportunity to kind of put a lens on my own positionality, which I think is really important in academia, especially when I would like to go into exploring more about race and ethnicity and culture. So I thought I'd kind of start at the beginning and look at my own first. So I did my master's project. And that sort of opened up a lot of questions. And I found that so interesting to ask about people's experiences, also living as British Chinese adoptees. And it opened up for further investigation. So I decided to do my PhD, sort of following off the back of my MA, and kind of explore the questions that I wasn't able to do in only a year of doing that kind of research.
Of course. And of course, it's such a personal topic and area of research. Why did it matter so much to you?
I think that in academia, I sort of read a lot about sort of race discourse and ethnic discourse. And I really felt that there was not that much representation on sort of British Chinese adoptee experience. There's a lot more discourse in America and Asian American adoptee experience. And I found a lot of literature on that. And I just felt like there was a little bit of an absence of a voice there. And I know that it might seem quite a niche experience, but I think that it also adds to a lot of discussion on belonging, and also just feeling that, you're in these spaces that you don't look like you belong. And that speaks to a whole host of different people that are not just British Chinese adoptees, but people that have lived here and perhaps have come from elsewhere, and how our experiences kind of overlap. So I really wanted to share my experiences and other participants' experiences of being, adopted, to kind of speak to this broader conversation about belonging.
Absolutely. I think it's such an important conversation to have. And to echo what you said, it's so easy to think, oh, but adoption, it's so niche. When actually, so many of the themes you talk about, they're human experiences as well. So I'm sure through your research, you've managed to touch so many people, not only within the adoption community, but just as people as human beings. And that's just really commendable.
Oh, thank you so much. And yeah, I very much sort of have a lot of gratitude to the people that volunteered to work on the study with me and volunteered their time. And it was really such a privilege to just listen to their experiences, because I learned so much through listening to other adoptees. And that was something that I will, really learn from and take away from as well.
That's fantastic. And going back in time a little bit, before the PhD, how did you kind of see adoption in your Chinese identity before you started researching it?
So I think I grew up in a predominantly white environment in Devon, and for a lot of my childhood and early teenage years, I didn't really think about my adoption that much. I kind of just forgot that sometimes I was even Chinese, which may sound a little bit strange, but I think growing up in a predominantly white space, I was very much wanting to fit in and to find belonging and to come from a white family and have a white friendship group. I felt that I wanted to kind of make myself feel like I belonged more. So I kind of downplayed my Chineseness a little bit, and I didn't really talk about it that much because I didn't really feel like it affected me. And I didn't really feel like it was something that I could talk to, a lot of people about, despite my parents being very, they've always been very open-minded and they've always been very communicative about my adoption with me. I didn't have that many diverse friends at the time. And I also just didn't have the kind of knowledge and awareness of myself as a sort of Chinese British adoptee. I didn't really see myself as Chinese at the time to focus conversations around that aspect of my identity.
It's so interesting that you say that you played down the Chinese side of yourself. Do you have any particular memories of doing that, or anything that stands out to you?
I think in a lot of ways it was very subtle, in the fact that in my school there was not very many people of color. There was another Asian girl who I always used to get mixed up on.
Oh, no.
And yeah, we did always kind of joke about it. And I, instead of feeling offended, and perhaps at the time I didn't sort of even feel offended to some extent, but I would always laugh off kind of microaggressions or the fact that we kept getting mixed up as one, and it would become a joke. And I would also make jokes about my Asianness to myself, to others, in a way to kind of make everyone feel very comfortable with my difference. If I made a joke first, then it was an opportunity for other people to not sort of do it first, and not to have it done in a kind of hurtful way. If I was kind of offering myself up, in a kind of jokey, humorous way, it was deflecting a lot of the kind of insecurities that I may have felt at the time. And I think by using humor to kind of downplay my difference, that's something that I did definitely a lot as a younger person.
So interesting. And as an adult now, looking back at that, how does that make you feel?
Yeah, I think I've very much changed a lot from when I was a kid, and kind of maturing into adulthood has really opened my mind. And especially doing this research as well, I've become a lot more aware of my own positionality, and I've started to let myself see myself as a British Chinese person, an adoptee, because growing up in a lot of white spaces, I didn't really see myself as, I guess, quote unquote Chinese. I saw myself perhaps as white to a lot of people, and to also myself. I would describe myself as a proxy white person because I basically was the only thing that wasn't is my sort of appearance. But I think unpacking that a lot more and doing a lot more research, I've really come to understand that to be Chinese isn't just to look Chinese, and it doesn't have such a neat label and category that I could automatically fall into. So that's really helped me navigate this kind of dual identity, which I've learned to embrace a lot more as I've got older than as a child, when I sort of used to look at it very sort of definitively and sort of binary and I'm British, I belong to my white family, and it didn't really have any room to be anything different.
It's so interesting. And going into the research, were there any particular questions that you wanted answered? Or were you kind of going in open-minded and just seeing what came out of it?
So, with my research, I did have some kind of core research questions to help guide because obviously it's such a broad topic that we couldn't cover everything. And I was particularly interested in how British Chinese adoptees navigated their racial and ethnic identity. I was very interested in how a white environment influenced their sense of self and also their perceptions of privilege. And finally, I was really, really interested in how British Chinese adoptees navigated their sense of Chineseness and also their sense of Britishness and what it means to be British and what it means to be Chinese, because these are also things that I struggled with. So I think using my own experiences as a British Chinese adoptee very much sort of pivoted my research questions. And I really wanted to invite a discussion that would not only overlap with mine, but also challenge my perceptions and experiences, and give me some more insight into how these questions are navigated by other people.
Absolutely. And I know you kind of answered this already, but do you have any kind of early memories of having any particular feelings around being Chinese?
I think that a lot of my early memories of being Chinese, I definitely don't think I was fully accepting of it. I do remember going to like prom and in my secondary school and not wanting to smile too widely because I
Really?
didn't want to have my eyes go small, because I think that's something that, quite a lot of people that I've spoken to that are of sort of, East Asian heritage, a lot of the comments that we face in terms of microaggression and racist comments are to do with our eyes. And I was very kind of self-conscious about that. So I do remember having a kind of insecurity regarding that. But I think I was just very focused on fitting in, blending in, and not sort of drawing too much attention. And if I did, it was more of a kind of like joker, humorous way. Therefore, I could kind of be in control of the narrative and not feel so, out of control, and, that the difference kind of defined me.
I think it's fascinating when you talk about using humour as a way to almost control the narrative. So even though what you're saying might be self-deprecating, it's like the thought is, but it's more important to protect the reaction I might get from other people. And it's wonderful now you're clearly in a very different position where you don't feel the need to do that anymore. But I think it is a very common experience between adoptees. And many people I've spoken to have said they'll make self-deprecating jokes about their appearance that'll often hinge on Asian stereotypes. And it is that attempt to try and get ahead of the game. So you can't take the piss out of me if I've already done it myself. And it's sad and it's not fair because we shouldn't have to do that. And I'm just so happy now that you feel you don't have to do that. And it is interesting just seeing the change from when you were younger to where you are now. And it just seems like there's been so much growth there, and that's just fantastic.
No, thank you so much for your kind words. And I think that it is very normal for young people to have this desire and this craving to feel like they belong. And for me, a sort of leverage into that was definitely humor and trying to make people laugh. So if I picked up on things that I thought would make people laugh, I would use that even if it was to my detriment, in order to sort of feel like I fitted in and I feel like I sort of belonged to that community more.
And if you saw your younger self doing that today, how would that make you feel?
I think I would understand where it's coming from, but I would feel kind of sad. But I think that a lot of times when you feel like you've got to kind of do something to please someone else, it's very complicated. And I can't say that I don't use self-deprecating humor now because, I think it's just very sort of integral to who I am, and I am quite a jokey person anyway. But I think when it's to do with something like my race and my ethnicity, I am a lot more careful with that, especially with people that I don't know so well as well, that I don't know if they're going to take that out of context. And it's a lot more sort of considered. And so I think that, in answer to your question, when looking back at my younger self, I would understand, but I would also feel kind of sad that I tried that hard to make myself fit in. And, I think it's perhaps a little bit cliche, but I do kind of wish that I didn't have such people-pleasing tendencies. But I do understand that it's quite natural for younger people to have that at that stage.
Definitely. You have to be kind to yourself.
Exactly.
And diving into your research, so you cover so many fascinating areas and themes, but one of those, of course, is navigating identity within predominantly white spaces. How was that for you growing up? I know you said already that you grew up in quite a white environment and there were only 2 Asian girls in the school. But beyond that, how did you really find being kind of the only Asian person really in a very white space?
Yeah, I think at the time, I didn't necessarily think about it too much and I deflected a lot. However, looking back, it's almost interesting because I almost feel the loss more looking back because I was so kind of oblivious and I wasn't really self aware in that way. I kind of missed the kind of lack of representation and the lack of diversity that I had around me. And I didn't spot the impact that had on my views and on my self perceptions. And I think that now, I can kind of link some tendencies that I did have and kind of link it back to, the lack of diversity in my environments. And for an example, I didn't really see that many people around me that were from China or Asian or even people of color, really. And I think that very much had a big influence on how I thought of myself. And, seeing myself as a proxy white person, perhaps I wouldn't have thought of myself as a white person if I had more diverse people around me. And that's not something that I blame anyone for, but it's more of just like putting the dots together that I'm able to do now. Whereas at the time I would just think, oh, I'm a white person because I just wanted to fit in with my surroundings. But now I realize that that was because I didn't have anyone that looked like me, or I had very few people that looked like me. And I didn't have the exposure to more diverse environments that showed me, people do, live their lives looking different and are successful being different. And I consider beautiful being different. And that's something that, I can look back now after knowing, and researching and talking to a lot more people about that. And that's something that, I can kind of connect the dots from.
Was it when you started to find yourself in more diverse spaces that you started to then relook at the way things were when you were younger?
Definitely. And that's such a good question as well, because I think when I went to university, I went to the University of Warwick. And it was a lot more diverse. And it was the first time that I had an environment where I wasn't surrounded by white people. And I, was able to kind of talk to people from different walks of life with different backgrounds and kind of share experiences and listen to their experiences. And it really changed the way that I viewed my own ethnicity and my own identity as well. And a lot of the time when I was growing up, for example, like I didn't really feel especially beautiful as Chinese, or it was kind of like a weird sort of paradox, really, because I didn't feel especially beautiful as Chinese, but I also was very aware that people would find me very attractive because I was Chinese, because of like, Asian fetishness. And I would always be very aware of that when I would go out clubbing or when I would, meet people, whether they had that fetish. But I think when I went to uni and I was like listening to other people's experiences and, all of that, I definitely think that changed the ways that I saw beauty, for example. And, I definitely think that it helped me accept myself a lot more for who I am rather than who I wanted to be, which was a really big thing for me at the time.
For sure. And would you say it's important for other transracial adoptees to grow up seeing themselves in other people? Or in the world around them?
Yeah, I think that representation is so important. And I think that when you're in an environment where you don't see any people that have a similar background to you or any people that represent difference that you can relate to, it's really hard to envision your future self, to envision yourself and sort of see yourself in 10 years' time being successful and being, really, really accepted into a community. And it's a lot easier to kind of see that happen when it's like on TV or in your groups around you or people that inspire you to then kind of help you envision yourself, in 10 years' time to do kind of the same and follow their footsteps.
For sure. You have to see yourself in the world to be able to know that you can do it too.
Exactly.
And in your research, going back to navigating white spaces, what did some of the other adoptees say when you were asking them about their experiences, and what were some of your key findings based on that area?
Yeah, so this was really, really interesting. And I definitely went into the research thinking that a lot of adoptees would have this kind of interchangeable notion of whiteness and Britishness, and also be like, I felt like a proxy white person too, yada, yada, yada. But I was very surprised to find that actually only a small minority, thought that. And it was also at a very early stage in their life. So when people were saying, oh, yeah, I felt like a white person, that was very often in childhood experiences. And now they were very much aware of the difference and, really emphasized the important distinction between seeing themselves as British versus seeing themselves as white. So that is one thing that I learned from sort of interviewing and, interviewing people in my focus groups, was that they didn't necessarily see themselves as white, but some of them felt that they just saw themselves as too different to blend in. Some of them felt like they couldn't escape their Chinese side, and this made them feel quite isolated. And others felt like they didn't necessarily see themselves as white, but they didn't see themselves as Chinese, and they just wanted to like fit in. And it was more about, blending in with their communities and not necessarily talking too much about race. So perhaps more of a kind of like colorblind narrative, that they didn't really see themselves as anything, in an attempt to kind of like blend in and, find a sense of belonging in predominantly white spaces. But again, it was such a varied response that it has been quite difficult. That was one of the challenges of the research, to kind of find these themes, because people's experiences are so varied. But that was one thing that I definitely took away from it.
For sure. I mean, it's such a funny one, because when I speak to other adoptees, and I know from my own experience, there is often that feeling of we're not quite Chinese enough, we're not quite British enough. And I don't know if that's something you've experienced yourself, but it's always that kind of, you're halfway between these two cultures, and where do you sit? And then when you are trying to seek out your culture or your identity, are you really doing it for yourself, or are you doing it so you're being accepted by other people? And did you find, speaking to lots of the other adoptees, that was kind of, that could be a bit of a struggle, just not knowing where they sat between this kind of Britishness and Chineseness?
Definitely. That was a really major theme. So I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I went into the focus groups and interviews and I asked them a question, do you feel more British or do you feel more Chinese? And after I had asked that question and I was analysing the results, I thought to myself that was quite a binary question to ask. And if I had gone back and done the research again, I would have really asked them a lot more open-ended question and really thrown the ball in their court and, say something about like, how do you identify, and just leave it at that. Because I think even me just framing it as a binary, do you feel British or do you feel Chinese, has then automatically planted a seed of, which category do I pick? And that's something that I kind of wanted to sort of avoid. But nevertheless, it did generate some really, really interesting findings. And I did find a lot of adoptees say that it wasn't straightforward. And some felt like, you've just mentioned, not feeling Chinese enough. And I think this very much stemmed down to what our perceptions of being Chinese is. And this whole idea that we have to chase a sort of westernized perception of being Chinese, because obviously our families and ourselves, we don't have any lived experience of being, Chinese and living in China. So when a transracial adoptee learns about their birth heritage, it's from people that haven't been in their birth heritage. So it's like kind of this secondhand sort of lens that we're learning about our beginnings from, which makes it very convoluted and also really difficult to obtain. So that's definitely come out of the research, and it sort of brought up this question of like cultural maintenance, which is this practice that I'm sure you're aware of, where like, all of us that were adopted, our families were very encouraged to keep up, heritage ties with our birth culture and like implement language into our lives and, try and perpetuate knowledge about China and things like that. But my research has really uncovered for me that it's a very complicated thing and sometimes, impossible. And also it kind of perpetuates this idea that China is like a homogenous kind of country and we're all the same. And, even, having Mandarin lessons and sort of thinking that, China has so many different dialects. If you're from Guangdong, then you might speak Cantonese, but, when we weren't offered Cantonese lessons. So this idea of feeling not Chinese enough has also stemmed from this notion of what Chinese is, which isn't necessarily, through lived authentic experience.
It is always a bit of a controversial one when you think, is controversial even the right word? But it's a really challenging one for adoptive parents because they might think, oh, I'm doing all these things to connect my child to their heritage. But then really, it might not quite be that. There might be attempts based on your view of what me being Chinese means. But is that really what being Chinese is as a Chinese person living in China? That's a whole other kettle of fish. And I remember you kindly sent over some quotes from some of the participants, and I'm absolutely paraphrasing this. But one of them said something like they, in terms of their adoptive parents, really tried, but they didn't really have any idea what Chinese culture was. And then they went on to reference, they celebrate Chinese New Year every year, and they might buy duck pancakes from Sainsbury's. Love a duck pancake. But really, in the end, it felt a bit inauthentic and a bit artificial. And did you find that was the experience for quite a few of the adoptees you spoke to?
Definitely. And I found that the majority of my adoptee participants were very sympathetic towards their parents. Like, it wasn't like they blamed them for the limited access to their birth culture. A lot of them were sympathetic and understood the limitations of their knowledge. But I think a lot of them did struggle with trying to reconnect with their so-called birth culture because, for one, some of them were not interested at all. And that's very common finding within young adoptees. A lot of us did not want to attend Mandarin classes on a Saturday, and a lot of us, weren't really interested. So that was one thing that they were tackling. And then another is just the acceptance that, of course, their parents, weren't able to provide the full access because what they're trying to give their children is something that they couldn't because they hadn't ever lived in China. So I think this whole idea of keeping up the culture that was kind of sort of like a policy guideline and, pushed on that respect was perhaps somewhat an impossible task to parents. Or we have to kind of redefine what being a British Chinese adoptee actually is. And instead of kind of like chasing this idea of being Chinese, we have to accept that our version of Chinese is different from someone that's lived in China and kind of embrace that and kind of, instead of chasing an authentic version, accept that our version is going to be different and it's not going to be based on lived experience, but that's still okay. And that's something that I'm kind of on a journey at the moment, trying to accept a sort of different version of Chineseness from the one that I was taught to kind of chase growing up.
I think that's such a powerful thing to say because you can spend your whole life trying to be Chinese in the most authentically Chinese way possible, but we can't, and we won't ever be because we didn't grow up in China, we didn't have Chinese parents, but that's also okay. And as you said, it's all about just trying to find your version of Chinese, your version of British, your version of being an adoptee, and you can be all those things at once. It's not like you just have to choose one or the other. And I know labels was something really interesting that you raised in your research. Do you find people do tend to feel like they have to be either British or either Chinese or either white or Chinese or put themselves in a box?
So I think I have personally found labels quite comforting, but this is something that I've been so grateful from learning about from the participants that I spoke to, and they really kind of made me think about this kind of comfort in the labels that we have. And some of my adoptees pointed out the limitations of labels and the fact that actually for some it might feel comforting, but for others it can feel really confining and something that they want to kind of strive away. And like some participants were very, emphasized the importance of seeing themselves first, not as a kind of label, but for the person that they are. And then they found that these sort of ethnic labels and these racial labels didn't really speak to who they truly were. And I think that's important as well. I think it's a very individual thing, whether you find comfort in labels or not. And I don't necessarily think there's, a right or wrong answer. But from what I've learned is it's really different for each adoptee. And I think that what my research tries to do is kind of shed a light at varying attitudes towards labels that some find useful and others simply reject just because they find them, limiting and not able to encompass who they truly are.
And when you were speaking to the other adoptees about labels, were there any particularly surprising responses?
I think all of the responses were very, very varied. Um, some were very much not wanting to kind of label themselves as Chinese at all, or felt maybe a little bit uncomfortable about labeling themselves as Chinese because they didn't feel Chinese enough. Sort of linking back
Interesting.
to, what we've spoken about earlier, and not feeling like they could claim that label, which I found so
Yeah.
interesting. And I think it really leads down to kind of feeling like you kind of belong to that community.
Hmm.
And because a lot of us are so disconnected from our birth parents and from our birth heritage and our birth community, we don't feel like we can have that label because we're not connected to the community. But others, found that sort of British Chinese what was also, a good way to describe them. And others simply just wanted to be, labeled as British. And they didn't necessarily want to be labeled as Chinese, not necessarily because they didn't feel Chinese enough, but they just felt that they were, fully encompassed in British life, and they
Hmm.
didn't necessarily feel like, the Chinese element really reflected their lived experience.
So do you often feel like when people label themselves as Chinese, they feel they need to earn that label in some way? Because I know you mentioned a few people didn't feel like they were Chinese enough to say they were Chinese. And I know one of the quotes mentioned that they don't feel Chinese. They'd like to be more Chinese, but when they try and act on it, it feels inauthentic and a bit artificial. Was that quite a common finding among some of the adoptees you spoke to?
Yes, definitely. And I think that's something that made me feel quite sad. And I
Mm.
also saw myself in a lot of adoptees' responses, because this idea that you have to earn a label, and especially a label that's constructed by people that are not Chinese as well, it's just so complicated.
Mhm.
And I think that this discussion arose a lot when we were talking about cultural authenticity, which I appreciate is not just a, adoptee question. And a lot of people from mixed heritage backgrounds, or, second, third generations also have this, notion of cultural
Mhm.
inauthenticity and, feeling like they've got to earn or not earn their labels. But from sort of the adoptees that I was speaking to, I definitely think it really spoke to not feeling like they belonged.
Mm.
And we spoke about things about wearing like traditional Chinese dress, for example. And, that brought up a lot of different opinions about some who would really not want to dress in hanfu or qipao, just because they didn't feel like they were Chinese enough to wear it,
Mm.
and they would feel like it was cultural appropriation, which I thought was really, really interesting.
Very.
And others who felt very comfortable in those clothes, and they felt like it was really nice to celebrate that side of them. So that definitely brought up some interesting discussion.
Of course. And of the ones who did feel comfortable to wear the traditional dress, were they the ones who tended to have more connection to their Chinese heritage, or were they just more confident about it?
Definitely for some. I think there was one participant in particular who was very interested in her heritage, very interested in sort of learning Chinese and learning about China as well. And she was really looking at connecting with her roots. But also, someone mentioned as well just the kind of fit of clothes, and, struggling in Western sizing, and it always being a little bit big, or, not necessarily catering to shorter people.
Mm.
And when she tried on, Chinese clothes and things like that, it felt like it fitted a lot better as well, which is something that, I definitely have overlooked as
Mhm.
well. And, some styles she might feel more comfortable just because it's just fitted her better.
Mm.
So I think that's also something that has, really sort of opened my mind to the possibilities of, what clothes mean to people, and what kind of this notion of tradition also means as well, and
Mhm.
whether we feel like we have access to that, even though we were sort of removed from that culture at birth.
For sure. And how would you feel about wearing traditional Chinese clothes?
So this is something that has very much changed before and after research. Like before research, I was on the train of, it's sort of a bit cultural appropriation. I didn't feel comfortable
Mm.
wearing it. I felt like fake. But since doing the research and since speaking to people, I have done a lot more work at trying to reconnect with my cultural heritage. And when I got married in the summer, I was even thinking about wearing a qipao to kind of honor that Chinese side of myself. But I didn't end up actually wearing one. But it was something that I really considered. And I don't think if I hadn't done the PhD research, I would not have even been considering wearing a qipao.
Wow.
I wouldn't have even crossed my mind. So I think in that respect, this research been really, really significant to
Mm.
me. and has really changed the ways that I've thought about myself.
It sounds very healing in so many ways.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's been very healing, but it's also opened up a lot of questions as well. And I
Mm.
think it's almost like not thinking about something for 20 years and then opening the Pandora's box. And then, I think about it so much more, but it's almost like trying to make up for the lost years of when I didn't
Yeah.
have any thoughts about it at all.
Absolutely. And as you said before, sometimes you might not think about being adopted for quite a while, but then that doesn't mean it's any less significant or any less important. And yeah, so did you find kind of your maybe teens or early 20s, it wasn't such a significant thing for you?
I just wasn't really interested in kind of exploring it that much. I didn't necessarily think it affected me that much. Um, Obviously, when I did my master's, COVID happened at the sort of in the middle tail end of it, and that really opened my eyes. And it was real reminder that I do look different and people do treat me differently. And even if I don't want to accept that, other people have already made their assumptions about me, and it kind of made me face how external perceptions impact
Mm.
my life,
Yeah.
even if I don't want to acknowledge it myself. So that was really, really eye-opening.
Mentioning COVID-19 was an interesting time for a lot of, well, Chinese but and Asian people, because so often we get just put under the umbrella of Asian. You talk about experiences of racism in your thesis. Could you tell me a bit more about the findings of your research based on that?
Yeah, so this brought up a lot of discussion, and I was really um blown away, and not in a good way, about people's experiences during COVID, and also just racist incidents that have happened to people in their lives. I wasn't necessarily surprised because most adoptees I speak to have had some kind of racist incident happen to them, or a microaggression at least. But it was really unsettling and disheartening to hear that even people that hadn't necessarily had anything happen to them in COVID were just so afraid to go outside, or so afraid to, you know, leave their house. And it was just that internalized fear that someone could say something that made me feel, that our voices are really important. And external perception can be so dangerous, and assumptions and stereotypes and all these things that we try and tackle, it's very, very, very damaging to people's lives. And I think that when I was listening to participant stories, I heard some really horrible incidences, some people like spitting at people
Oh
or
my
coughing at
God.
people. Like, it was really awful. And I think that the discussions that we had around that was very complicated, because while some participants said that they felt in solidarity with other East Asian communities, others felt even more isolated because they'd never felt part of those communities before the pandemic. But now, when we were all sort of clubbing together and Asian solidarity, it was very kind of conflicted because they'd never felt like they belonged in those communities
Mm.
before. So creating these bonds because of their experiences during COVID, at a time when everyone needed to kind of come together, it was very difficult for them because they didn't feel, they kind of felt rejected from them before that.
Mm.
So that was something that we talked about from those instances. And that's something that I, really thought about. And another thing that a participant very much said was that she never really felt like she was an outsider until, the pandemic happened. And it was very much a reminder to people that, we don't look like we belong,
Mm.
even if that's something that we hadn't really thought about before.
It must be really shocking going through life. And I know a couple of the participants said they or sometimes forget their Chinese. And then to be reminded by something like that is just horrific. And I'm so sorry that they had to experience that. It's dreadful.
It was really upsetting to hear. And I was so encouraged to be in the kind of focus groups where there was so much warmth. And so, like, all of the participants were so caring and empathetic, and angry, frankly, as
Mm.
well, for how their fellow participants had been treated throughout this time. And also just in terms of having racism, towards them as well. And it was really lovely to see that, obviously there was differing opinions amongst these groups, but when it came to sharing really personal stories, people were very, very sympathetic and very validating as well. And it was really nice to share those experiences in a space where people, were very, very empathetic.
I mean, the fact you created that safe space for people is so commendable, because I can imagine it is such an isolating experience, especially going through that as a Chinese British adoptee. Because going back to what we were saying before about not feeling quite Chinese enough, I can, again, I'm not going to speak on behalf of anyone else, but if that were me and someone treated me like that, I kind of think, well, this is a racist experience, but am I Chinese enough to even claim the word racism? And then that's a whole other thing. So I'm like, where do you even start with it? It's so complicated, and it's just not black and white. And it must bring up so many mixed emotions and complex feelings for those people.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that the participants were really, really brave in sharing those stories and experiences, because I can't imagine how painful those would have been to revisit. But like you said, conversations did arise where people felt and expressed kind of conflicted emotions about sharing instances of racism and microaggression with other people of color as well, because they were conscious that, their experience weren't as bad, or, it's sort of going along the lines of comparing experiences, which is, very dangerous, but also, it can kind of invalidate the person that's speaking. So I completely understand why they feel that, but it just highlights the complexity of having these discussions. And, it's not always easy to talk about them, because people are just so aware of other people's experiences. And a lot of people, even in the group, were saying things like, oh, I'm so lucky to not have experienced any racist incidences, especially during COVID. And I really reflected upon that. And it's just like, because we're, talking about this lucky narrative as an adoptee, linking back to why you're describing yourself as feeling lucky that you didn't, undergo racism or have racism directed towards you. It's just so interesting how this word lucky is very much used in different contexts, because frankly, you shouldn't feel lucky that, you didn't have to experience racism. Like, in an ideal world, no one would have to experience that. But it was interesting that that's the kind of language that several participants used, obviously offering their support and their sympathy to the participants. But yeah, it was just interesting sort of identifying the kind of terminology that they were using.
Absolutely, because I know the word lucky does get thrown around a lot when it comes to adoption, and that's something you really delved into. But I'd never considered it in terms of not having to experience racism. But going on to kind of the narratives of luck or privilege to have been adopted, why do you think that's such an important thing to talk about? And actually, for anyone who might not be aware, could you give them a little overview of what that can sometimes look like?
Of course. So I think with these narratives of being lucky and being grateful, I think a lot of adoptees have grown up in environments where their parents have adopted them. They've often, but not all the time, have often been adopted by sort of middle class, white British families who have been, quite financially stable. And a lot of people were influenced by things like the documentary The Dying Room, which was aired in the late 90s, which very much showed the impoverished nature of orphanages in China, a sample of orphanages in China. And that very much sort of drove home this kind of need to go over to China and save the kind of poor orphans and bring them over to England where they would have a better life. And I think that a lot of people, especially in, my parents' generation, we kind of look at us and think, we've come from a very impoverished situation and been brought up in the opposite. So it's understandable, I guess, when you're looking at it from that perspective, why they would say that. But I think it's important to discuss and unpack the sort of damage that those kind of attitudes and perceptions have on the adoptee's life. Because if you're forever going to feel grateful or feel lucky, then it's sort of a debt that you can't really repay back, isn't it? And it's something that was outside of the adoptee's control as well. And it creates this unequal relationship between the adoptee and the adoptee's parents, where they're never going to feel enough. So yeah, I think it is really important to talk about that and unpack that. But I definitely, understand where that sort of attitude comes from, whilst I may not agree with it. I think it just comes from sort of the lack of awareness and, savior narratives that were perpetuated by the media, And I think, perpetuated in societal conversations. And I think also just as a result of not having enough awareness about adoption, especially, during the early 2000s, which is when a lot of my sample were growing up.
I think, the whole luck and the gratitude thing is such a complex one. And it's one that I wasn't really aware of until I started speaking to other adoptees. Was it something that you were aware of when you were younger? Or do you remember anyone ever saying to you, oh, you're so lucky to be adopted?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, I was listening to another guest that you had in your podcast, Kellen, and they were saying about how they experienced that when they were younger. And I completely relate to that. It was a lot more prominent when I was younger. I haven't heard anyone say that to me for a long time. But as a kid and as an early teenager, people would, family friends or my friends' parents and things like that, they would very much be like, oh, you're so lucky to grow up in a affluent neighborhood and things like that. And at the time, I would feel very lucky. And I even did a presentation at school in about year 8 or something. And I stood up there in front of my classmates and I basically said that I was very grateful for my parents because otherwise I would have ended up in a paddy field in China.
Oh, wow.
And, it was very much this narrative that I owed my parents my privilege. And that is something that I personally have had to critique. And that's something that I really wanted to explore in my research because I was really interested to understand if other adoptees had kind of gone through the same situation or experiences, or how they dealt with navigating the kind of privilege that is expected that we've had. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that, all adoptees as well in my sample very much were grateful for the lives that they've had and their parents and the love and the financial support. But that doesn't mean that they should feel grateful for being adopted. And that's, two important and separate things as well. So, that came out of the discussion too.
Absolutely. And do you find often people they miss that nuance, and people assume if you say, oh, I've got negative feelings towards being adopted and, oh, I shouldn't have to feel grateful. A lot of people will look at that and go, well, you've been given a second chance, inverted commas, at life. You've been handed this whole new life on a silver platter. What do you have to be ungrateful for? You should be so grateful your parents flew over to China. You should be so grateful for this. You should be so grateful for that. But actually, no one's saying they're not. We're just saying we didn't choose this very one particular thing, which comes with a lot of grief, a lot of loss, and quite frankly, trauma. And to tell any child or any person that they should have to feel grateful for that when they didn't choose it, it's a bit absurd, I think.
Yeah, exactly. You hit the nail on the head. And I was speaking to a friend about this actually, and her sister created a TikTok. And in the TikTok, she explained the difference between feeling grateful for your life, but not feeling grateful for your adoption. And actually, she had so much backlash, which I perhaps naively, was surprised about. But a lot of people were like, oh, you're so ungrateful. They were, really, really nasty to her. And they just didn't understand why adoptees are not forever grateful to their parents for being adopted. And they don't understand that it was a decision that their parents made. And in the same way, biological children don't feel grateful for being born.
Exactly.
So, I don't think that adoptees should feel grateful for their adoption. And it's important to make the distinction between what they're grateful for, because otherwise, again, it just creates that unequal relationship that they're never going to be able to leave, really.
Absolutely. And do you feel like your own definition of grateful, or the things you've chosen to be grateful for, have changed over the years? Because I know you said in school, oh, I'm so grateful my parents adopted me. And then now, do you think it has a slightly different meaning?
Definitely. And I think that I'm always very careful to praise the support and the love that my parents gave me and the opportunities that they gave me, but as a separate thing to my adoption. And I think a lot of people forget as well that adoption has come from loss. And regardless of how happy and supportive and loving your adoptive parents have been, the reason why you have come, into these kind of experiences and being given these opportunities is because you were basically denied living with your biological family for whatever reason that is. And I think that's important to kind of think about, and people don't necessarily think about that because they think that one negates the other, when actually, the adoptee comes from a place of unknown and they're put in a completely different context. And the two are really incomparable. And you can't really say, that they are comparable, because you've got really nothing to compare what it was like before, because you didn't know what could have
Yeah.
happened, I suppose.
I think when people throw around those words like grateful, a lot of assumptions are made when you say that. You're assuming that the life you'd have had in China is worse. You're assuming that just because you're going to a country that might be more financially or societally privileged, you're assuming that equals happiness. And you're assuming that the life that the adopted child is going to have is better than the one they would have had in their birth country. And they're wild assumptions to make. And again, if you go back to your comparison, if a biological child was born and they were told you should feel grateful for being born, and then we assume that just because they've been born, they've got a better life than the life they would have had, I don't know, in the womb or wherever else they were going to be, people would say that's nuts and it just wouldn't really make sense. So it's mental that we've also put the same projections and ideas onto adoptees.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that what you said about comparing different situations is so interesting, and it's really important as well, because I think that often from like a Western kind of perspective, there's a lot of narratives that are going around being like, oh, you must have been impoverished, and I grew up thinking I would work in a paddy field, or people think that they're going to work in XYZ. And whilst life would have looked completely different, and undoubtedly there would have been hardships, and I think it's really complicated to compare your life now to a different context in a different country, where happiness, like I know you mentioned the word happiness as well, it can't be defined by how much financial wealth that you have. And I think that sometimes when we're in a completely different context, it's easy for us to be like, oh, well, our life elsewhere would have been, really, really bad because of the privileges that we have now. But because we're comparing it to something that we don't know and also and haven't experienced, it becomes very convoluted, and, it doesn't necessarily, it isn't comparable. It's very, very difficult to.
For sure. And another thing you touch on in your research is the impact of adoption organisations. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and why they are so important?
Yeah, so a lot of my participants came from networks that I knew growing up. So I went to a 4-day summer school, and that was organised by parents that adopted at the same time in the late 90s. And they organised a summer school, which was a 4-day school where people would go and they would have Mandarin lessons and, learn about Chinese culture and mingle with other adoptees. And I think from speaking to the participants, what they gained from that summer school was really the relationships that they had with other adoptees, and not necessarily the kind of cultural maintenance techniques that were presented to them, but actually being in a space where they could have conversations about their identity, or not even having those discussions, but just knowing that they were understood and not necessarily questioned in the same way that someone would be like, oh, where are you from? Or, why are your parents white? And all of these questions. And that was something that was very refreshing and comforting to a lot of the people that I spoke to. And then there was another organization, Catch All, which is children adopted from China. And we spoke about the significances of that. And again, similar to summer school, people did find that very comforting and rewarding. But that's not to say that everyone felt comfortable in those spaces. There was a lot of discussion about people expecting adoptees just to get along just because they're adopted, which obviously isn't true. And some people, especially those who felt more, I guess, self-conscious about how they looked and perhaps wanted to fit in more, especially during childhood as well, found those spaces quite complicating and confronting. And I remember one participant in my master's saying that she didn't feel Chinese enough to even be in the spaces at summer school, which I found so interesting, because we often didn't necessarily talk about, our identities as sort of 10-year-olds. But it was, really sort of confronting for some people to have to go into a space with predominantly, Chinese people, which is very, very different from what they're used to and their kind of environments that they've grown up in, and what that kind of makes them feel. And it kind of makes them, face that side of themselves, which they perhaps haven't had a chance to process at that time.
For sure. And kind of looking back on your research, how has hearing all these different stories from other adoptees kind of changed the way or shaped the way you now think about your own situation?
I think it has just made me more aware of people's varying experiences. And I've been really careful to not make my thesis, the voice of adoptees or anything like that. It is really a snapshot in time of participants' lived experiences that are forever changing. And this is something, again, that, I've learned as well. And, we spoke about not necessarily speaking about adoption or thinking about adoption in our early years and in our teenage years. And even adoptees in their adulthood might not necessarily think about it, and it might be because of these kind of life-changing events of like maybe becoming a parent or thinking about parenthood, that we kind of circle back to our birth parents and thinking about that. So I think this research has really showed me the kind of ever-changing nature of adoptees' experiences and attitudes towards adoption that are always going to be changing and are always going to be influenced by the context and the environments that they've had throughout their lives.
And has it been quite validating for you if perhaps you came into this with quite a few questions? Have some of those been answered, or have you found closure in a way?
Definitely. I think that before my research, I didn't think about my adoption or being Chinese much at all. And I also was quite like pro adoption, but in the sense of like I hadn't really thought about it and I didn't really kind of, think anything bad of it, I
Hmm.
suppose. And I think learning a lot more about the system and learning about the circumstance, I've become a lot more critical about
Hmm.
adoption itself. And that's something that this research has shown me, to be a lot more critical and listening to other people's experiences and to acknowledge the loss that comes with adoption, which is something that I perhaps never personally allowed myself to grieve for because I very much thought, oh, it's in the past. I need to just focus on moving forward and not think about it. But then realizing how the past affects the present in so many ways
Hmm.
and allowing myself the space to kind of heal from that and actually grieve for the unknown story has been really cathartic. And also just the fact that listening to other people's experiences has been very validating for me personally as well, as someone who is on a kind of journey to reconnect with my heritage and to kind of continue thinking about it. And that's something that the PhD has helped me do, and I don't see it as an endpoint. I see it as kind of like a stepping point towards figuring out my sense of self and my identity as a British Chinese adoptee.
And did you find it challenging at any points being kind of confronted with so many people who have technically have a shared experience, but have such different experiences within that?
Definitely. And I think one of my fears is kind of having all of my participants sort of read my work, and I really want them to feel seen. And I've really tried my very best to make nuanced analysis that has been sensitive to the context, because what I really want to do is highlight my interpretation of their response. And, rather than being like, this person said this and that's their truth, it's more like, this person said this in this context and I've interpreted it like this, but I could be wrong. There could be multiple different reasons. And I really want, when the participants read it, to kind of know that that was the place where I was coming from, to kind of explore, interpret as sensitively as possible. Because I do feel like these experiences are so personal, and I genuinely feel so grateful for people that have, shared those with me, that the last thing that I would want to do is kind of misinterpret or, represent them in a way that they didn't want to be represented. So I've just tried to be as sensitive as I can. And I just hope that the participants are happy with what I've written.
No, I'm sure they'll be thrilled with the way you presented their stories. And it's so powerful that you've spoken to so many adoptees with such a wide variety of experiences. And I think even if people just reading that, if the only thing they take away from it is that every adoptee has a different story, different feelings, and a different experience, that in itself is incredible and something that just needs to be celebrated. So you should be so proud of yourself.
Oh, thank you so much.
No.
And yeah, I think that this research has really showed me how to listen and interpret a variety of different experiences, but also know that research in itself is not a singular truth either. And everyone's got their own versions and everyone's got their own experiences. And my job as a researcher is to kind of shine a light on those experiences at the time, rather than to be like, this is what British Chinese adoptees feel.
For sure. And kind of zooming out from, looking at adoption more as a system, we know China recently banned international adoption. I think it was around August 2024. Has that shaped the way you see adoption as a system? And has that changed your feelings towards your own story?
That's such a good question. And I think that at the time of China stopping international adoption, I was already questioning my views about adoption. So, whilst initially I was quite shocked by the decision, I felt after processing it very complicated. For one thing, I felt hopeful that they would promote more domestic adoptions, because I do think that it is better for the child to grow up, if they can, in their own culture with their own sort of language, because I think that is really important for the child's development and connection. But I also felt sad for the parents that were in the middle of adopting that couldn't. And also the fact that we will be one of the last generations of British Chinese adoptees. And that is kind of a weirdly isolating experience and really conflicting because of my views about adoption. Whilst I think it's good that we're promoting more domestic adoption, I also feel sad that we're going to be, one of the last generations.
The dinosaurs.
Yeah, exactly. I think it is kind of like an isolating, feeling to feel like there'll be less people that have the same experiences or similar experiences to me. But also I feel happy that, that hopefully they will be looking to not necessarily promote that anymore, and people can be kept within their birth country, which I think is a good thing.
Absolutely. And since doing your research, have you found it easier to then talk about adoption as a system and then separately talk about it personally? Because I can imagine sometimes it can be a bit blurred, because you might have certain opinions on the system, but then you might have a very happy life and you have so many good memories from, as a result of being adopted.
Yeah, I think that is tricky to navigate. But I think actually from the way that the system is, and my personal views have kind of like been influenced by the research that I know about adoption, and like listening to the British Chinese adoptees specifically and their experiences. And it's kind of like changed the way that I view adoption, and has made me a lot more critical of it. And has also just made me realize that, you can have the most loving home, and it's not about criticizing the parents, and it's not about criticizing the families. It's more about critiquing whether it's right in an ideal world for a child to be brought up in an environment that is so different from their ancestral home. I think that's what I'm critiquing, and rather than sort of critiquing the kind of upbringing, it's more about, whether that's the right policy. And I think a lot of us were told about the one child policy, which definitely, caused a lot of decisions at the time for people who couldn't afford to raise their children. But I think people forget about the impact that policy had, and that a lot of people and a lot of parents didn't want to give their children up, but they absolutely had to because of this new policy, which meant that they were giving up children that they would have wanted to keep, which then makes it really difficult then to think about people being adopted from parents who would have kept them if the policy wasn't implemented. So just kind of unraveling it like that and looking at it from that perspective, rather than critiquing the parents who adopted, because I don't think it was their fault at all. I think, I think the situation in China wasn't necessarily known very well, and we were only hearing what kind of things that the media were telling us and what China was kind of promoting at the time as well, which makes it very tricky.
Absolutely. I think in a lot of cases, the birth parents are left out of the adoption story, and it starts from when they're abandoned by their parents, and that's all we hear. Whereas you do forget that a lot of these people are people who desperately would have wanted to keep their child and had to either make the hardest decision of their lives, or that decision was taken from them. And that's heartbreaking. But then also to have the maturity to be able to look at your own situation and go, I had really loving parents. I'm very happy in my life now, and I'm thankful. I choose to be thankful for certain parts of my life. but then remain critical of the system. I think that's a very important differentiation to make. And yeah, lumping it all together and again, making generalizations, it's always a little bit risky. And I know we touched on it quite a lot now, but really, how has the PhD changed the way you see yourself, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, the PhD has been a big part of my life for 3 years, and it's really made me think about my identity and my adoption. And that's a continuing internal and also external discussion that I'm having with my friends and family, and really impacted the way that I see myself. Like, I'm really working towards embracing being Chinese and allowing myself to use that label and not feeling bad about it. And whilst I can't change the way that I feel overnight, I think it's a real shame how people feel barred from identity labels because of these kind of notions that we were told to chase, which I don't necessarily think are that true. So I'm just sort of working on kind of fully embracing my kind of Chinese heritage and my Chinese identity, and surrounding myself with people that I can have these discussions with. And, one of the biggest things that I have learned from, listening to my participants is that, I think we should all, allow ourselves the grace to appreciate that whilst we have so many amazing opportunities that have come from being raised in Britain, we are also allowed to grieve the loss of the beginnings that we've all had. And that's completely okay. And that doesn't make us ungrateful. And I think that that's something that, several participants have told me. And I've really, really benefited from hearing that. And I hope that other adoptees who kind of hear this, I do hope that they also feel, like they can explore these labels without necessarily feeling like they don't belong or they shouldn't, identify as that, because I think that, it really just sort of challenges what we were taught in the first place, I think.
It's wonderful you found that multiple things can be true at once. Just because you believe one thing doesn't take away from something else, or just because you think this doesn't mean that you're criticizing that. All these things can be true at once because we are so complex, and adoption is such a complex topic. And it's brilliant that you kind of created a space where people could feel all of that and validate each other and also validate you personally. It's a really incredible thing to do. I'm honestly in awe of you, honestly. It's fantastic. And coming out of the research, is there anything that stayed the same? Because I know we've talked about what's changed, but I'd love to know if there's anything that actually just has stayed the same.
When I think about what stayed the same, I always knew that adoptees would have varying experiences. And that was something that I was careful to consider for my master's as well. And I think this just re-emphasized that everyone has varying experiences. And when you're given an opportunity to do research, which I appreciate, so many people don't have that opportunity, even if they'd want to. I think it's just really important to emphasize the variety of different experiences that adoptees have. And my PhD doesn't tell the whole story. In fact, it really asks a lot of questions, and it leaves a lot of questions unanswered as well. And I think that I just hope it kind of encourages more research to happen in these communities. And so we can kind of take away points about belonging and identity that resonate with a wider community as well.
Definitely. And is there anything you wish people understood more about adoption?
I think I wish that people would not assume that we're in this position because of these kind of lucky and grateful narratives. And I also wish that people wouldn't be scared of the topic of adoption. And I think that obviously I'm not speaking for all adoptees, but me personally, I often find people go a bit weird when they're like, "Oh, you're adopted."
Oh, they do. Yeah, they definitely do.
And I think that they just need to gauge whether the person is comfortable, because I think you can often tell. And people that don't want to talk about their adoption will not bring it up, and you will get a vibe most of the time. And I think a lot of us are quite open about it. And actually what makes it weird is the fact that the person asking has gone all weird, and then we feel like we have to spend emotional labor making them feel better about asking us whether we're adopted. So I think I would just ask people to gauge a little bit more and not be afraid of it. Like, it's not, something to be afraid of. And in fact, I encourage more people to have these conversations, because hopefully we can kind of, work on changing narratives about adoption, together, and that only happens with open communication.
Honestly, I could not agree more, because if someone does get weird about asking you, then you immediately get uptight and it makes you feel uncomfortable, and then you don't want to overshare for fear of potentially making them uncomfortable, and then the whole thing's just really bloody awkward and not an ideal situation for anyone. But that's such an important piece of advice, because I think there are a lot of people who don't want to offend, but they are curious and they want to know so they don't say the wrong thing further down the line. So just to have this advice is really valuable. So thank you.
No, thank you for asking the question. And I think, it's obviously important to be sensitive, but I think that, when people are a bit more direct and ask the person first whether they're okay with speaking about it, and if they say yes, then, by all means, I think they should just, have that conversation. And I think it would benefit them.
Absolutely. And do you have any advice for other adoptees who might be navigating cultural identity at the moment?
I think it's important to just not be too hard on yourself. And I think that we can often try and feel like we have to pigeonhole ourselves into categories that may not feel like they represent us. And actually, it's okay if we don't feel like we fit. Identity is not something that can be, summed up in a neat kind of box. And I think the expectation of these notions of what it means to be Chinese, what it means to belong, all of this needs to be thought about perhaps more fluidly, and, embracing that we can actually enjoy aspects of Chinese heritage and Chinese culture. And that's okay. And that's not sort of something that we should feel like is barred to us. And I think it's just more about exploring culture, if that's what adoptees want to do, in their own way, and being gentle with ourselves and allowing us to feel like we can, rather than feeling like we shouldn't.
And do you think it's important for adoptees to feel they can create their own labels, or they can decide exactly what it means to them, what Chinese means, what British means, and there's no one way or the other? It can be entirely what you want it to be.
Exactly. I think you summed that up really nicely. Like, that is something that I would wholeheartedly agree with. Like, I think that adoptees spend a lot of time, and this is very much what I did as well. I spent a lot of time worrying about, other people and how I was perceived and what I should do to be Chinese, but actually to kind of reclaim agency and to reclaim our own narrative by being okay to label ourselves in the way that we want to label ourselves, and not feeling like we have to fit into other people's assumptions, and really try and work on like creating our own paths ourselves and not feeling so kind of pressurized to stick with a familiar narrative.
I could not agree more. And finally, is there anything else you'd like to leave listeners with?
I think I just want to thank everyone for listening, and I've really enjoyed having this discussion with you. So thank you so much for having me on. And I just really hope that we can all begin to feel more comfortable having kind of difficult conversations with the people that we love and the people that we care about. And often, by asking people if they want to talk about things more that might seem scary or too personal, by asking permission to have those conversations has helped me kind of open up and explore how I felt. So it might be something worth considering, doing a bit more with people that you feel comfortable doing that with.
Absolutely. I might try to do that myself as well. So thank you. But thank you so much for coming on and having this chat. It's been really wonderful, and I'm so grateful to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Kat's research is hugely important and sheds light on so many shared experiences we have as adoptees, and more widely, just as humans, navigating identity and belonging. I love the reminder that just because we might not think about adoption at certain times in our lives, it doesn't make it any less important or any less of who we are. And finally, the thing that really stuck with me was the powerful reminder that listening to other people's stories can so often help us find clarity within our own. I guess that's really what the podcast is about. I want to share as many adoption stories from as many perspectives as possible to help people feel seen, understood, and have their stories heard. We post episodes every other Tuesday, and you can find us on Instagram and TikTok at Not Made in China Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.